The city burned for 3 days before it finally died. I watched from the women's quarters through a narrow window that looked out over the valley as smoke rose in thick columns that turned the sky the color of old bruises. I watched as our walls, which had stood for generations, crumbled under Spartan rams. I watched as our warriors, men I had known since childhood, men who had taught me to climb olive trees and told me stories of heroes, were driven into the square and made to kneel in rows while Spartan officers walked among them, deciding who would live as slaves and who would die as examples. My father was among them. I saw him from the window, his hands bound behind his back, his head bowed not in submission, but in exhaustion, in the kind of defeat that comes not from losing a battle, but from watching everything you tried to protect be torn apart in front of you. I wanted to call out to him. I wanted him to look up and see me one last time. But my mother's hand clamped over my mouth, and she pulled me away from the window, and she whispered in my ear with a voice that shook with terror, "Do not let them notice you. Do not let them see your face. Do not give them any reason to remember you." But they remembered us anyway. They remembered all of us. History remembers Spartan glory, their shields painted with the lambda, their courage at Thermopylae, their discipline that made them the most feared warriors in Greece, their laws that created soldiers from birth, that turned boys into weapons and made weakness a crime punishable by exposure on the mountain. History remembers all of that. It carves it into stone and sings it in verse and teaches it to children as if it were something noble. But this was the part they never carved into stone, the daughters of the defeated, and the secret they buried in silence. When the city finally fell, when the last of our defenders had been killed or captured, when the fires had consumed everything that could burn and left only blackened skeletons of buildings, the Spartan commander gave an order. All women and children were to be gathered in the central square. We were to bring nothing, no possessions, no food, no water, just ourselves. My mother tried to hide me. She dressed me in her oldest clothes, rubbed ash on my face to make me look sick, wrapped cloth around my chest to hide the shape of my body. She was not trying to make me ugly. She was trying to make me invisible. She had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories about what happened to the daughters of cities that resisted Sparta, about how they disappeared, about how some were taken as slaves and others simply vanished, never spoken of again, as if they had never existed at all. But you cannot hide in a conquered city, not from soldiers who have been trained since childhood to notice everything, to find weaknesses, to root out anything that might pose a threat or hold value. They went through every house, every room, every corner. They pulled women from cellars and children from under beds and old men from storage rooms where they had hoped to die quietly rather than face what was coming. We were herded into the square. Hundreds of us, mothers clutching infants, old women who could barely walk, girls my age, some younger, all of us with eyes wide and hands trembling, all of us understanding, without being told that something terrible was about to happen, but not knowing exactly what form that terrible thing would take. The Spartan commander stood on a platform that had been hastily constructed from the rubble of our market stalls. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that made size irrelevant. He wore his armor as if it were his skin, the bronze polished to a shine that caught the morning light and turned him into something that seemed more statue than human. He spoke in a voice that carried across the square without needing to shout. He said that our city had resisted Sparta, that resistance had consequences, that the men would be sold or executed. The decision would be made individually based on age and utility, that the elderly and the infirm would be released to whatever fate awaited them in a city with no walls, no food, no protection, and that the women, particularly the young women, would be taken to Sparta to serve the state in whatever capacity the state deemed appropriate. My mother's hand tightened around mine. I felt her nails dig into my palm, hard enough to draw blood. She leaned close and whispered, "Remember who you are. Remember your name. Remember where you came from. No matter what happens, do not let them take that from you." Those were the last words she ever spoke to me. If you're still here, maybe you're one of the few who believes these voices should not be forgotten. Stay, subscribe. Because after this, silence will no longer protect them. They separated us by age. The very young children, those under 10, were taken to one side. I do not know what happened to them. I have tried not to imagine. The older women, those past childbearing years, were pushed toward another group. The rest of us, the daughters and young mothers, were formed into lines. They inspected us. Not violently, not the way you might expect soldiers to behave after a conquest. The Spartans were methodical. They checked our teeth, our hands, our bodies, looking for signs of disease or weakness. Those who passed inspection were marked with red ochre on the forearm. Those who did not were sent to join the elderly. I passed inspection. My mother did not. They deemed her too old, too worn by years of work and childbirth to be worth transporting. She tried to stay with me. She grabbed my arm and refused to let go until a Spartan soldier struck her across the face with the back of his hand, and she fell, and I was pulled away before I could reach for her. I looked back once, just once. I saw her on the ground, blood running from her lip, her eyes locked on mine. And I saw in that gaze everything she wanted to say, but could not. I saw her love. I saw her fear. I saw her guilt that she could not protect me, and I saw her desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, I would survive whatever was coming. That was the last time I saw her face. We were bound with rope at the wrists and connected in long lines, 20 or 30 women per line, so that if one fell, we all stumbled. We were marched out of the city that same day, before the sun had reached its peak, before we had been given water or food or time to grieve. The Spartans did not explain where we were going. They did not need to. We all knew. We were going to Sparta, to the city that had destroyed ours, to the place that would now define the rest of our lives. The march took days. I lost count of how many. Time became meaningless, reduced to the rhythm of footsteps and the pain in my legs and the thirst that made my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth. Women collapsed along the way. Some were allowed to rest briefly. Others were simply cut from the line and left by the side of the road. I do not know if they were killed or abandoned. I do not know which would have been more merciful. We arrived in Sparta at night. I remember that detail clearly because the darkness made everything seem worse, more alien, more threatening. Sparta was not like my city. There were no grand buildings, no decorative columns, no markets filled with color and noise. Everything was functional, austere, designed for utility rather than beauty. The buildings were plain stone. The streets were wide and straight. Even the houses seemed severe, as if beauty itself were a weakness that needed to be eliminated. We were taken to a compound on the outskirts of the city, a series of low buildings surrounded by a wooden palisade. Inside, there were more women, not just from our city, but from others. I heard languages I did not recognize, saw faces with features that spoke of distant lands. We were all captives, all daughters of cities that had resisted Sparta, all brought here for purposes that were explained only through absence, through the things that were not said, rather than the things that were. We were fed, a thin gruel that tasted of nothing but filled the emptiness in our stomachs. We were given water. We were allowed to wash, though the water was cold and there was no privacy, just a large room with stone troughs where we stood together, shivering, trying to remove the dirt and blood and shame of the journey. And then we were assigned to houses. I was sent with 5 other women to the home of a Spartan officer. His name was Lysander. I learned this not because he introduced himself, but because the slaves in the house spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones. He was a veteran of multiple campaigns, a man who had earned glory in battle and commanded respect through violence. He had a wife, a Spartan woman whose face seemed carved from the same stone as the city itself, hard and cold, and showing no emotion except occasionally contempt. Our role in the household was not clearly defined at first. We were given tasks: grinding grain, hauling water, washing clothes, scrubbing floors, the kind of work that slaves had always done. But there was something else, something unspoken, that hung in the air like smoke. The way the Spartan wife looked at us, with a mixture of disgust and something else, something that might have been pity or might have been resignation. The way the slaves, who were themselves conquered peoples, avoided our eyes and spoke to us only when necessary. The way Lysander himself watched us, not constantly, not obviously, but with a casual assessment that made my skin crawl. The first night, nothing happened. We were sent to a small room, barely larger than a storage closet, where we would sleep. There were no beds, just mats on the stone floor. We lay down together, pressed close for warmth, and we did not speak. What was there to say? We all understood. We were waiting for something. We just did not know what form it would take or when it would come. The second night, the door opened after dark. A figure stood silhouetted against the torchlight in the corridor. Lysander. He pointed at one of the women, a girl named Althea, who could not have been more than 15. She stood. She had no choice, and she followed him out. The door closed, and we were left in darkness. She returned hours later. She did not speak. She lay down on her mat, turned her face to the wall, and made no sound except the irregular catch of her breath that told us she was crying. None of us asked what had happened. We already knew, and asking would have forced her to relive it, to put into words what should never need words, because it should never happen. But it did happen, night after night. Sometimes Lysander, sometimes other Spartan men. Officers who visited the house, who were offered hospitality that apparently included access to the captive women. Sometimes soldiers from the barracks, young men still in training who were given us as rewards for excellence in their exercises, for demonstrating the kind of ruthlessness and obedience that Sparta valued above all else. We stopped screaming, not because it didn't hurt, not because we accepted it, but because no one came. Because screaming only made them angrier, made them crueler, made the nights longer. We learned to be silent. We learned to disappear into our own minds, to retreat so far into ourselves that we could watch what was happening to our bodies as if from a great distance, as if it were happening to someone else. The days were almost worse than the nights, because during the day we had to pretend normalcy. We had to grind grain and haul water and scrub floors as if we were simply slaves doing work, as if nothing else was happening, as if the bruises and the limps and the hollow eyes meant nothing, and the city itself pretended. Spartan women passed us in the streets and looked through us as if we were not there. Spartan men who had been in our rooms hours before would walk past us in daylight without acknowledgement, without recognition, as if we truly were invisible. There was one boy, a Spartan youth who could not have been more than 12 or 13. He lived in a house near the compound where some of us were kept. I saw him sometimes, watching us from a distance, his face conflicted, his young mind clearly struggling with something. One morning, I was drawing water from a well when he approached. He looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then he asked me, in a voice that cracked with the awkwardness of his age, "Does it hurt?" I stared at him, not understanding at first, and then understanding too well. "Yes," I said, "it hurts." He looked down, kicked at a stone. "My mentor says that real Spartans do not ask about women, or tears, or what happens after dark. He says that is the way of things, that you are spoils of war, that we earned you." I should have been angry. I should have told him that we were not things to be earned, that we were people with names and families and lives that had been torn apart. But I was too tired for anger, and he was just a boy, already being poisoned by the same system that had poisoned every generation before him. "Do you believe that?" I asked. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I do not know what I believe, but I know that sometimes at night I hear sounds from the houses, and they do not sound like victory. They sound like something else." Then he walked away, and I never spoke to him again. But I thought about him often, wondered if he grew into a man who questioned what he had been taught, or if he simply learned to silence the part of himself that had once been capable of doubt. There was an older Spartan soldier who lived in the house where I was kept. His name was Brasidas. He was a veteran, close to the end of his service, with scars that covered his arms and a limp from an old injury. Unlike Lysander, he did not come to our room at night. He barely looked at us during the day. But I saw him once, standing outside, staring at his hands as if they were foreign to him. His lips were moving, forming words I could not hear. Later, one of the slaves told me that Brasidas washed his hands constantly, multiple times a day, more than was necessary, as if he were trying to wash away something that could not be seen. I wondered what haunted him, what memory made him scrub his skin until it was raw. Whether it was something he had done in battle or something he had witnessed in his own home, in the rooms where women were taken and where Spartan honor conveniently did not extend. This was not what Lycurgus meant by glory, I heard him whisper once, though I do not think he knew I was nearby. Lycurgus, the legendary lawgiver of Sparta, the man who had supposedly created their entire system, who had written laws that turned Sparta into a military machine. I wondered if he had envisioned this. If when he imagined a society of warriors, he had imagined the daughters of defeated cities being used and discarded. Or if this had simply evolved, a natural consequence of a culture that valued strength above all else, that saw mercy as weakness, that divided the world into Spartans and everyone else. Time passed in that place. Weeks became months. Some of the women died from illness, from despair, from injuries that were never treated. Their bodies were removed quietly, and new women were brought in to replace them, an endless cycle of conquest and suffering that seemed to have no end. I thought about escape. We all did. We whispered about it in the few moments when we were alone, when the guards were distracted, when it seemed almost possible. But where would we go? We were deep in Spartan territory. We did not know the roads. We had no supplies, no weapons, no allies. And the punishment for attempted escape was death, often public, often slow, designed to ensure that no one else would be tempted to try. One woman did try. Her name was Kira. She was older than me, maybe 25, and she had been in Sparta for over a year. She had watched too many women die. She had endured too many nights, and she finally broke. She ran during the day, which was bold but foolish. She waited until she was sent to the market to purchase supplies, and then she simply ran. She made it to the edge of the city before they caught her. The Spartan soldiers brought her back, and they made all of us watch what happened next. I will not describe it. I will only say that afterwards they left her body in the square for 3 days as a warning, and that none of us tried to escape after that. But Kira did accomplish something. She had hidden a message before she ran. A small piece of cloth with words scratched into it using a sharpened bone. She had placed it inside a crack in the wall of the compound, in a spot where it might not be found for years, or might never be found at all. One of the other women discovered it after Kira's death and showed it to us in secret. It said, "We were here. We suffered. We were not things. We were people. Remember us." We memorized those words. We repeated them to ourselves in the dark. We held on to them like a prayer, like a promise that even if we did not survive, even if we all died in this place, someone someday might find that cloth and know that we had existed, that we had been more than just footnotes in Sparta's history. There was one night that I remember more clearly than any other. It was winter. The cold had seeped into the stone walls and settled there like a living thing. We were huddled in our room, trying to share warmth, when the door opened and guards came in. Not just one or two, half a dozen. They told us to stand, to gather what little we had. We were being moved. We were not told where or why. We were simply marched out into the night, through streets that were empty and silent, to a larger compound near the military barracks. When we arrived, we saw that other groups of women were there as well. Dozens of them, maybe 100 in total, all of us captured daughters, all of us taken from cities that had resisted Sparta. And then we saw them, the fathers, the men who had been captured alongside us, who had been sold as slaves or put to work in mines or assigned to labor battalions. They were brought to the compound as well, forced to stand in lines facing us. I scanned their faces desperately, looking for my father, hoping and dreading in equal measure that I might see him. I did not find him, which meant he was dead or sold so far away that he might as well have been. But other women found their fathers, and the Spartans made them watch, made the fathers stand there helpless as their daughters were led away one by one into the buildings of the compound. It was a message, a demonstration of power, a reminder that Sparta controlled not just our bodies, but our very identities, our relationships, everything that made us human. They could take us in front of our fathers, and the fathers could do nothing, say nothing, because to speak would mean death, and death would mean leaving their daughters even more alone than they already were. I did not go into the buildings that night. I do not know why. Perhaps there were simply too many women and not enough time. Perhaps it was random selection. But I stood in that courtyard and watched women I knew, women I had shared rooms with, women who had whispered stories of their homes and their families, disappear into those buildings. And I watched their fathers collapse to their knees, silently weeping, breaking without sound because even grief was forbidden to them. That was the night I understood fully what we were. We were not slaves in the traditional sense. We were not even truly prisoners. We were symbols. We were living proof of Sparta's dominance. We were the price that defeat carried, the consequence that made cities think twice before resisting, the secret that everyone knew but no one spoke of, because speaking of it would require acknowledging that the glorious Spartan warriors, the men who stood in phalanx formation and held the pass at Thermopylae, were also men who did this. Years have passed since that night. I am old now. I survived, though survival is perhaps too generous a word for what I did. I simply did not die. I was eventually released from service when I became too old to be useful, too worn to be desired. I was given my freedom in the same casual way I had been taken, as if freedom and captivity were just administrative categories that could be checked or unchecked at will. I live now in a small house on the edge of a city that is not Sparta and not my home. I have no family. The women I knew in the compound are dead or scattered. The men who used us are dead or old. The system that created all of this has evolved, changed, but not as much as you might hope. Different empires, different wars, same consequences for the daughters of the defeated. But I remember. I remember every name, every face, every woman who shared that room with me, who whispered prayers in languages I did not understand, who held my hand in the darkness, who chose silence over screams because screams changed nothing. I remember Althea and Kira and the girl whose name I never learned, who counted the nights by scratching marks in stone until one night she stopped counting and just stared at the wall until she died. And I remember the secret, the thing that Sparta never carved into stone, the thing they never sang about in their victory hymns or taught to their children in lessons about glory and honor, the thing that lay beneath the discipline and the courage and the legendary reputation, rotting in the foundation like a corpse that no one wanted to admit was there. Sparta wrote of honor, valor, discipline, but never of the daughters. If you are still here, if you have listened to this entire account, then you carry this story now. You carry it where stone and history refuse to. The question is, what you will do with it. Will you let it be forgotten again, buried under more comfortable narratives of ancient glory? Or will you remember that behind every empire's triumph there are people who paid a price that was never recorded, never honored, never even acknowledged? Comment if you want me to uncover more truths they buried beneath their glory. Because this was not the only secret, this was not the only city. There are more voices in the silence, more daughters who were never named, more truths that were carved not in marble, but in flesh, in memory, in the spaces between what history chooses to tell and what actually happened. I am one voice, one survivor, one daughter who refused to let silence be the final word. But there are others, and their stories too deserve to be heard.